All right. Happy, I guess it's Sunday today. Happy Sunday, guys. I don't know if you guys have completely lost your sense of time as well. Um, I thought that I would post a couple of videos just kind of doing some review of some of those key points that you're going to want to focus on in terms of your studying. Also note that I have posted a bunch of resources for you in terms of Kahoots that you can do. There are lots of good Kahoots that are out there. I highly recommend just kind of typing in ABA, or if there's a particular, if you want to do a Kahoot on operant conditioning or classical conditioning, or if you want to do a Kahoot on understanding like positive reinforcement versus negative reinforcement and punishment. There's lots of good ones out there. I've also posted a Word document with some sample, some practice exam questions for you. And so I thought what I'd do is kind of just make a couple of videos, run through each of the lectures, kind of pointing out some of the high points that I think that you should identify, and make sure that you're really familiar with in order to prepare for your exam on March the 30th. Also note that I will be hosting some virtual office hours where I'll be available to kind of answer any questions that you might have. Those will be completely driven by you. So come prepared with questions and things that you want some further clarification on. Okay. So I'm getting started way back. So go way back to kind of the beginning of September. This is week 2, where we talked about classical and operant conditioning. I do want you to be able to understand and know kind of those 4 philosophical assumptions underlying behavior analysis. So you're going to want to know what selectionism, determinism, parsimony, and philosophical doubt are, and how you would exemplify those in your practice out in the field. So you're going to want to be able to say, oh, so if I'm acting in a parsimonious fashion, this is how I would do it. So if someone has a headache, well, the parsimonious explanation for that would probably be something like they're tired and they have a headache, whereas a non-parsimonious explanation for that would be something like, well, they have a brain tumor, right? So we're looking at the simplest explanation first when we're talking about parsimony. So you want to be able to define and then provide examples for those things. I want you to think about classical conditioning. Make sure that you're very familiar with kind of this. So what happens in the process of classical conditioning? Well, we've got a neutral stimulus that doesn't elicit a response. In the process of conditioning, that neutral stimulus is paired with that unconditioned stimulus, which kind of elicits that unconditioned response. So then after conditioning, that neutral stimulus then elicits that conditioned response, right? And so we remember in Pavlov's example, well, there was the bell and then the food, and the dog would salivate, and then suddenly, through the process of classical conditioning, Pavlov's dogs were simply salivating at the sound of the bell. So the sound of the bell became that conditioned, elicited that response, and it became that conditioned stimulus. Okay? So when we're thinking about key terms, that unconditioned piece means that they're unlearned. Conditioned means that they've been learned. Okay, be familiar with these terms, that an unconditioned stimulus evokes that response. An unconditioned response happens every time the stimulus is presented. Through that process, the conditioned stimulus, through training, comes to evoke a response, and that conditioned response, the response that was learned along the way through many trials. Okay, so be familiar with kind of those unconditioned stimuli. Be familiar with kind of these examples in terms of being able to walk through the process of classical conditioning. But again, being mindful that probably what we want to focus on is things like operant conditioning, because Skinner is our BFF. And we know that operant conditioning is the basis of applied behavior analysis, okay? And so we know that operant conditioning is that 3-term contingency, right? Antecedent behavior consequence, or stimulus response consequence. That stimulus is some environmental event. The consequence is either reinforcement or punishment of our response. Okay? So make sure that you know very well what operant conditioning is and what classical conditioning is, how they are the same, how they are different. Let's go into week 3, which is our 7 dimensions of ABA. It's a good throwback, right? My goodness, it feels like forever ago. So you are going to want to make sure that you are familiar with the 7 dimensions of ABA. So remember that really helpful acronym. You got it? Thinking about it? Yeah, if you said get a cab, you're correct. So the acronym to remember those 7 dimensions of ABA is get a cab. So here they are, right? Applied, behavior, analytic. We better know those ones. Technological, conceptual, affective, and generality. And so when we are thinking about what's important when it comes to the 7 dimensions, well, you're probably going to want to know what they are. So know what those 7 dimensions are. And then how would we exemplify these things in the work that we do? So be able to define them, be able to speak to them and give examples. So, you know, if we're looking at the applied dimension, for example, and we know that the applied dimension means that it's something that is socially significant, that it has some meaningful value to the learner. Well, we're talking about, you know, teaching functional communication before we're teaching, you know, how to identify the different types of trees, right? So we're talking about making sure that that particular program that we're going to run with a learner has social significance, because we know that everything that we do in behavior analysis should have social significance. And when we're talking about the applied dimension, that's what we're talking about. We're thinking about behavior. We're thinking about things that are observable and measurable. They are those overt behaviors. That's not to say that we don't think that private events happen, because we know that they do. But when we're talking about behavior, we're talking about those things that we can actually see and measure. We're analytic, right? We make sure that we collect data on everything that we do, because that's going to tell us whether our intervention or our programming is effective or not. Technological means that it enables replication, right? So if we're thinking about things, we're thinking about like a great example of this is a recipe. So someone gives you a recipe for chocolate chip cookies, chances are pretty good that you should be able to head to your kitchen and make chocolate chip cookies that taste very, very similar, if not the same. Conceptual, you know, our interventions are evidence-based. So you guys did your big assignment back in January where you took a look at research articles. That's what we do when we plan for our programs. We consult the literature and make sure that we're really familiar with the evidence that supports those particular interventions. We don't do things on a whim. We don't do things that don't have evidence. The things that we implement actually work. That's what we're talking about when we're talking about effective. And generality, that whatever we do, we can see it across a variety of settings, across a variety of people, with a variety of materials or objects, that it happens over time, that we aren't just teaching this particular behavior inside a vacuum. Okay, so please make sure that you are very familiar with those 7 dimensions. Again, remembering that acronym, get a cab. Behavior Babe has a really good video that kind of explains all of these concepts, so feel free to fall back on that. Let's go to week 4. Operational definitions and data collection. Oh, we jumped. That's right. I remember now. Please hold. Okay, so remember we did our assignment on operational definitions. We practiced this. We want to be able to know what the important elements are of an operational definition. We know that an operational definition provides this kind of very detailed description of what behavior we want to change. They are not dictionary definitions. They are customized for each learner. Right? So we need to make sure that our operational definitions allow us to really clearly describe the behavior that we want to change. So imagine that you want a brand new person who's never interacted with a client before to come in and observe a particular behavior. Well, you need to make sure that you're spelling out every single aspect of that they could then capture. Okay? We know how important a good definition is. We want to make sure that our operational definition is written in sentences. They are not point form notes. That we are only focusing on one particular behavior. That they're relatively short. They're as long as necessary. They typically begin with the name of the behavior. That they are that they include things that can only be seen or heard, and that we can include some non-examples or exceptions when necessary. Okay. So those 4 essential elements of an operational definition are the label. So what is it that we call it? So we might say it's sitting. We might say it's screaming. We might say it's hair pulling. We are going to provide that very clear definition of what that looks like. We're going to provide examples, and we are going to provide non-examples. Okay. It does not include anything like goals, programming details, that type of thing. So if we go into, actually, I'm going to pause this here because I'm approaching 12 minutes and I only have 15 minutes. So in the next video, we will start off on week 4.